cultural competence inclusion is going to be controversial. With the recent Brexit vote, with the inclusion of Donald Trump as a candidate for the Republicans, even with what's happening in Australia in terms of the treatment of refugees and asylum seekers, there is likely going to be a very difficult response to the inclusion of something designed by the European Union, designed in a Eurocentric way to measure what it is to be culturally competent. Now, although PISA, Andreas Schleicher, designing this cultural competence component, have done their best to mitigate any bias in terms of what it is to be culturally competent, it is of course going to be criticised, particularly by countries that may not see some of these components as worthy of measure or evaluation. If you actually go and look through at the different components that are being included, some of them could be seen to be quite idealistic in a sense, thinking about expecting too much from students at this stage in their education. Also thinking about the influence of what's happening politically, particularly in English-speaking Western nations, and thinking about what's happening as we move away from an acceptance and embrace of immigration to a more insular approach. The questions themselves have been validated to the best of their ability. I expect there'll be some change before 2018 in response to some of the changes happening in policy. As we see conservatism and rightism pushing up, particularly in European countries, there might be some surprises in terms of how well students engage. But I think this gives us rich data to work through in terms of what we're doing with our students, where our students are at in terms of understanding, and how prepared they are for a changing world. If students live within a context that may have issues such as nationalism, such as anti-Islamic sentiment, as we're seeing in many countries at the moment, there are going to be enormous challenges, and there are going to be challenges to the credentials and to the worth of including this assessment. Some parents, some schools are going to think that the cultural competence component is not as important as the other three dimensions. I think that this is remiss for us to overlook, because I do think that it will inform the way that education proceeds, and that finally we're going to start moving away from a reliance on high-stakes assessment as underpinning our education system in Australia, in the United States, in other OECD countries, to thinking about the lessons that can be learnt and the communities of belonging that can be constructed during the schooling years. What we want from our schools is to produce tolerant, creative young people who do go out and share their ideas, who aren't subject necessarily to media pressure, to politicians' pressure, thinking about what's happening in their home contexts and ways to critically engage and challenge some of these ideas that perhaps are not as constructive as others. Overall, I do think there'll be controversy about the inclusion of the cultural competence unit, but I think it's time. And I think it's something that is reflective of many movements in education. Education leaders now talking about global citizenship, talking about international mindedness, talking about our education systems and what we can learn from one another, what we can share with one another. I think it will be a great opportunity for teachers to reflect upon their practice, to reflect upon measures of inclusion for students, and to think about taking our education system forward into a more productive space and a space that accommodates students from various backgrounds as well.